Today, we're so pleased to be here celebrating the new book by Anne Applebaum, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Anne Applebaum was one of the first journalists to raise the alarm about Russian interference in US elections and anti-democratic trends in Europe. Her 2018 Atlantic article, A Warning from Europe, inspired this book and was a finalist for a national magazine award. After 17 years as a columnist at the Washington Post, Anne became a staff writer at the Atlantic at the beginning of this year. She's the author of 3 critically acclaimed and award-winning histories of the Soviet Union: Red Famine, Iron Curtain, and Gulag, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Today we're here to talk about Twilight of Democracy, the seductive lure of authoritarianism. Twilight of Democracy explains with electrifying clarity why some of Applebaum's contemporaries have abandoned liberal democratic ideas in favor of strongman cults, nationalist movements, or one-party states. Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny, says Applebaum, quote, sets her sights on the big question: how did our democracy go wrong? This extraordinary document, written with urgency, intelligence, and understanding, is her answer. And that's it. I think we're ready to get going. So Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you and turn off my video, and we'll get going. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm actually talking to you. I'm actually in Poland, so it's evening my time. But I think independent bookstores are so important that I'm really glad to support one, even in faraway San Francisco, maybe especially in faraway San Francisco. And it's really nice of you all to take out time from your day to listen. So as you just heard from the introduction, or maybe some of you might know, my history as a writer is that I've spent really most of the last 20 years writing history books, and very often long history books. They've been histories of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I wrote a history of the Gulag. I wrote a history of the Ukrainian famine. I wrote a history of the Sovietization of Eastern Europe after the war. And these are all, if I can make fun of myself for a minute, I mean, they're weighty, long books. They took many years to write. I spent many years working in archives while preparing for them. While writing about them, I looked at the history of those periods from different points of view. I looked at what other historians had said. I looked at it, the history of the Gulag from the prisoner's point of view, from the guards' point of view, from Stalin's point of view. And I really tried to write as an outsider and with some degree of objectivity. The point of writing these books was to find out what had happened and to explain it. The book that I've just written and that has just been published, which is called Twilight of Democracy, is quite a different book. It is a subjective book. I'm part of the story, and I explain why in the course of the book, that I am biased. I have a point of view. It is also a book about history. It's about the historical events, the political change in the countries that I've spent time in over the last 20 years. And it's about how that affected people I know. And so although it is a book about broken friendships, to some extent, it's not really a book about friendship. It's a book about what happened to a particular group of people whom I happen to know. And that group is a group that I would characterize as center-right, sort of journalists, intellectuals, some politicians, a group of people who were attracted to, again, center-right ideas, and who, from the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, held together as a kind of coherent unit. And because of my strange personal history, I'm American, but I moved to Poland in 1988 actually, as a reporter. I wound up marrying somebody Polish, and my husband became a Polish politician. And so I have long and deep ties here. I also worked for many years in Britain for the British press. I worked for a British magazine called The Spectator, which was sort of, the kind of Tory intellectual magazine. It has very old history. It goes back a couple of hundred years. And at the time I was working for it, I mean, you could have probably described it best as Thatcherite. you know, as an American, I knew who some of my counterparts in this country, I mean, in the United States. And again, I knew the people who worked for the Weekly Standard and for the National Review, as well as people who worked for the New Republic and the Washington Post and so on. So it was a single world. What I realized a few years ago, and this really started in 2014 and 2015, and then became really kind of abundantly clear in 2016, was that group of people whom I would have called Reaganites or Thatcherites, or, you know, some of them maybe free marketeers, although, you know, or, some of them were cold warriors, some of them were anti-communists, some of them were, you know, you would have, I mean, certainly they were all in favor of, again, democracy, free markets, and a belief in a certain idea of the West, or of Western liberal democratic culture. You could have knitted them all together as a kind of group. And what I realized in the more recently was that group had fractured, and that a lot of the people who were friends and who were kind of comrades in arms 20 years ago or 30 years ago were not only no longer friends, they don't speak to each other. And the reasons are not personal, they're political. And because that group has really fractured down the middle. And in the US, it's the Republican Party. In Britain, it's the Tory Party. And in Poland, it's the Polish center-right as well. And I knew this had happened. I felt it in my own life and with my own friends. And I spent a long time, first of all, trying to figure out what had happened, and then trying to pinpoint a moment when we had all been unified, and what did that moment feel like. And the metaphor that I came up with is the metaphor of parties. Who were at which parties at what time? And this is not because this is a group of people who give great parties. I'm not a great hostess. You know, I like parties, but because when you look at who came to the parties and when, you can see how they change over time. And so the book, this is a very short book. As I said, it's subjective, not objective. It's not based on archives. It's based on my memories, my reporting, and books and things I've read that I think are relevant. And the book begins with a party. And the party is a party that took place at this house where I am now, when it was much less finished than it is now. This is a house that was my husband and I, well, my husband's family really bought as a ruin in the 1980s and renovated. And the project of renovating the house felt like we were renovating the country. You know, we had won back Poland's freedom in the 1990s. We were rebuilding the country. And in 1999, on the millennial New Year's Eve, we decided to have a party. And it was a fairly scruffy party. It wasn't a fancy party, but the people who came were people that we knew. They were journalists. They were sort of junior politicians. They were a few friends from the US and from Britain. And the mood of that party was really, really extraordinarily optimistic. You know, here we were, you know, the Cold War was now 10 years behind us. Poland was going in a good direction. You know, it was going to be integrated with Europe. It was going to be part of the world. We all felt like we more or less agreed on that direction and what it meant. And we were going forward. Then, as I say, when I look back now on the people who were there, a number of them have made very radical turns. And the book explores what was the nature of that radicalism and what is the origins of the radical right in Poland, in Britain, and in the United States. And the answers are not all the same. There's not a single explanation. So this is not a book that political scientists will like, because I do not come up with a single thesis and then bang everyone over the head with it and prove that this is what happened. Instead, I look at a few careers and lives of people that I know. And I also look at some of the ideas and emotions that link them, and that link them to some figures from the past. Just to give you an example, one of the people that I write about is a man who is he's the president of Polish television, and Polish state television, I should say. And Polish state television, for those of you who know Britain, or really any European country, know that state television in European countries is an important institution. It reaches everybody. It's free as opposed to cable television, which you pay for. In Poland, there's about 30% of the country that really only watches state television. It's the only television they have access to. There are several channels. There are several radio channels. Poland is now run by a ruling party, which is called Law and Justice, which when it came to power, one of the first things that it did was to take over state television, which by law was supposed to be nonpartisan or bipartisan. It was supposed to be public television run by a kind of committee. And they took it over, they changed the nature of it, and they made it into a kind of party propaganda television. One of the people I write about is the man who became the head of this propaganda television. And just to give you a little flavor of what the station is like now, we've just had a presidential election here, and one of the persistent and common central themes of the election was what the Polish president called LGBT and the threat of LGBT ideology. And this is an LGBT, by the way, is a phrase that sounds strange in Polish. It's not even clear what it means. It's an English sounding acronym. And Polish state television, again, this is public taxpayer paid television, repeated over and over again. You would see programs every night, discussions of whether, if the opposition were to win the election, whether, the National Day parades would be replaced by gay pride parades, whether there was such a thing as LGBT ideology. And they pushed this as an issue throughout the campaign. About half the country, a little bit less, unfortunately, than half the country finds this offensive and it makes them angry, but a part of the country finds this kind of language appealing. So who is the head of state television in Poland? He's somebody whose brother is the head of the largest liberal newspaper in Poland. So you have, even within one family, and I should say whose newspaper fought against very much this kind of strange anti-LGBT, anti-gay campaign, sort of homophobic campaign that was being run by his brother. So within one family, in one Polish family, you have, one person who has gone along with this, it's a homophobic, but it's also an authoritarian ideology. It's with a political party that seeks to destroy the institutions of the state, that seeks to undermine the press, the judiciary, and other institutions. And on the other hand, you have his brother who's fighting against it. And I go through his life. I look at the ways in which he was disappointed by modern Poland, both as a state and personally. He was somebody who felt that he was a kind of teenage opposition leader like his brother, and he felt as Poland, joined Europe, joined NATO, became wealthier, he hadn't really quite found his place in it. And he finally found his place by becoming head of this television station, in which capacity he can sort of take revenge on all the people who he felt blocked him in the past. And that's one of the things that you can see him doing. To add spice to the story, I explained that I am also one of the people who he has attacked, or who the television station has attacked. So I describe that in the book as well. But this feeling of disappointment or resentment or pessimism about one society and the decisions that it's taken over the last several decades is one that I then find in some other countries as well. In Britain, I look at the careers of several, again, they were young journalists when I knew them. One of them is Boris Johnson, who's now the prime minister. Another is an old friend of mine called Simon Heffer, who was also on the right at that time, and who became really convinced of the damage that the European Union was doing to Britain, and was one of the very early proponents of the movement that became Brexit. And I talk about how his disappointment with modern Britain, his feeling that we've lost the great leaders, we aren't what we used to be, we've lost something about our past, was also one of the important motivations for him. And then for Boris Johnson, this was this deep emotion that I think the sort of English nationalists and Eurosceptics in Britain expressed. This was then taken up by Boris Johnson and made into a political project, which I personally don't think he believes in, but he's now stuck with. Book also looks a little bit at the United States, or well, actually there's a long chapter on the United States. And there I talk about the people who were the young Republicans. And I start that chapter with another party, actually. And this is not a party that I was at, but it's one that was described in a famous article in the New York Times Magazine. It was a cover story about the new elite, the new young conservatives. And there was the young Laura Ingraham and the young Bill Kristol and the young David Brooks and the young David Frum, and a whole host of people who were at that time kind of up and coming young conservative writers and thinkers. And that group has, of course, now bifurcated completely, with David Frum and Bill Kristol being profoundly anti-Trump, both of them working. Bill Kristol actually runs an organization now called Republican Voters Against Trump. And with others, including the young Laura Ingraham, who's also at that party, and who I knew slightly, for several years, now one of the chief propagandists for Donald Trump on Fox News. And once again, I go through some of their biographies and I look at some of the echoes, both from other countries, from European politics, and from the past. And I do return over and over again to this almost apocalyptic sense of pessimism that a part of the right felt. The Cold War was a moment when there were great causes, and the anti-communist right in all of these countries actually felt that it was doing something important. And it also should be clear that those were coalitions. There were different parts of the right. There were people who were part of the Cold War coalition because they cared about, raison d'etat and Russian nuclear weapons. There were some who were part of it because they cared about human rights and democracy. Others were Christians and they disliked the Soviet Union because it was Marxist. But all of them felt that they were, whatever they were there for, there was a great cause. In the 90s and afterwards, the feeling that we lack a great cause, that there is no big project today, that our leaders don't have any grandeur, they don't have the skill and the charisma of leaders in the past, I think really began to permeate the right. And you began to get deep pessimism, real nostalgia, and not just a sort of reflective nostalgia or missing the past, but a restorative nostalgia, believing that we've lost something, we're missing something, that modernization or modern life has harmed America, that we've been somehow, we've lost our virtues, we've lost our citizenship, we've become degenerate. And that feeling of pessimism also motivated a number of people to become radical, and profoundly radical in ways that we used to think of the left being radical. People who doubted American institutions, people who didn't really believe that democracy was worth investing in anymore, people who believed that when the Republican Party won, it should seek to undermine institutions, and who subsequently did not object when Donald Trump began to abuse power and began to abuse some of those institutions when in office. Again, the book doesn't offer a complete picture, and each of the stories, there's no there's no narrative. There's simply echoes. Each one of these stories echoes one another, and it describes where this pessimism comes from, where this anxiety about modernity comes from, and how it's been translated by a handful of intellectuals, many of whom later became journalists or spin doctors, into a political project. I'm happy to answer questions about that book. I mean, I'm hoping a little bit that some of you might have had a chance to read it. If you haven't, it's very short. I'm also happy to talk about my previous books, which some of you may have read, on the Soviet histories, and I'm happy to talk about my journalism in the Atlantic as well, which maybe some of you have read. Anyway, happy to hear your questions. I do wish I was there with you. These kinds of events are always more interesting and more meaningful when you can have real interactions. But maybe we can, maybe we can talk about a few things now.
Thank you so much, Anne. That's wonderful. We do have some questions that are popping up that I'm going to start us off with. Let's see. Denise asks, have you heard from any of the people you write about regarding your observations? Have you caught up with any of these people?
So all of them, everybody who I wrote about, I did try to contact. So all of them, where I wrote to them, I said, well, I want to discuss why our differences.
Mhm.
And I reached out to them with made a couple of exceptions of people who I didn't know well, but the ones of whom there are full portraits, I did reach out. So I reached out to Laura Ingram, who's described in the book. I reached out to this chairman of Polish television, Jacek Kurski, who I described in the book. And all of them said no, with one exception. I did go to see a Hungarian friend of mine called Maria Schmidt, who's now the kind of top propagandist for Viktor Orban. He's the prime minister of Hungary, who has run this very virulent anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic campaign, which is part of what keeps him in power, and has also, very deliberately cracked down on Hungarian press in particular, and on opposition parties. I did speak to her, and it was one of the odder experiences of my life. I interviewed her. I flew to Budapest to meet her. And I've known her for many years. She's a historian of communism. She wrote a very good book. She runs a museum that was dedicated to the history of communism and fascism in Hungary that I was at the opening of in 2002. And she and I sat down, and she speaks good English. And I've known her, as I say, for many decades. And she sat down and she said, I'm speaking in Hungarian. I have a translator here, and I'm tape recording this conversation. She sort of plunked a tape recorder in the middle of the table. And we had a very strange, kind of strained conversation. After which she published the conversation, quite significantly altered, actually. It was kind of translated oddly. And the conversation was published in such a way that it made it seem if she had interviewed me. So it was why have I changed? And so that was her reaction to the book. From the others, I haven't heard from anybody directly. So no is the answer. And I don't really expect to. Most of the people who I write about at length are people who are now really committed to, either it's the project of Trump or it's the project of, far right, illiberal politics in their countries, and they're very unlikely to see me as somebody who would be even safe, or to speak to. Do I still speak to people who voted for Brexit or people who voted for Trump? Yes, I do. I mean, so it's not like I've lost all of my friends. This is a book about, as I say, committed. These are political entrepreneurs. These are people who were really committed to those projects and tried to make them work. That doesn't mean I don't talk to people whose politics are different from me. Quite the contrary. In fact, I very much do, and I'm delighted to hear from them. When it's possible.
Thank you. So we have a couple of related questions from Cindy and Robin, talking about the sort of deep pessimism you're talking about, and that the relationship of that pessimism to multiculturalism or racial justice. Do you see that kind of like structural pessimism as like an organization specifically against racial justice or a multicultural national identity, or?
So I wouldn't put it quite like that. And again, this is the racial question is a little bit different in all these countries, right? I mean,
sure.
So you have to be careful about generalizing. But I would say that in a number of cases, there is a reaction to demographic change. And whether that means immigration, or whether it means feminism, or a change in traditional social hierarchies, very often it is a reaction to that. And so one of the interesting things that you find, the far right in Europe, historically, these far right political parties used to hate each other, because what were they? These are nationalist parties, so of course the nationalist French party hates the nationalist German party, and they all hate the nationalist Italian party, because that's the nature of nationalism. So historically they were never linked, these movements. Now they are, and they're linked partly because there are a couple of things that they now agree on, and they do agree on their opposition to immigration, and their preference for traditional values in some form. Again, that means something slightly different in different countries, but their objection to the rise of women in the workforce, or the women gaining power, or as the questioner seemed to intend in some cases, people from alternative or minority groups gaining power. So that is something that now links together many of movements. So these are nostalgic movements that look back to a previous era when things were better. And what was one of the things that was better was that everybody was the same skin color, or that's what it seemed to them, or that's how they remember it. And there was a social hierarchy that that was preferable to them. And so that is a common feature. I mean, again, it sort of has a slightly different flavor in each country, but the nostalgia for the past is often nostalgia is an objection to the demographic and social changes that have taken place over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask, was the way you were talking about this as a social shift across individual people that you know personally and have known. Do you think the changes that you're talking about and mapping indicate a change in general in how the West understands itself politically, or what Western politics is?
So that's a really interesting, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, one of the things that we always underestimate is the degree to which our sense of ourselves and our self-worth is somehow connected to our image of our country and what our country means. And there is something, there is a reason why Americans are so famously optimistic, kind of irritatingly so to Europeans. And one of the reasons is that I think we all felt for a long time that, we live in the best and greatest country in the world, and ours is the best and strongest democracy. And I do think that the rise of other countries and the feeling that the United States doesn't speak as loudly as it used to is a part of this pessimism. And so the sense of lost power is part of it. And also, I think the weakening of the bonds among Western countries has weakened the support for liberal democracy. I mean, we all tend to think of, Americans in particular, think of, our liberal democracy has nothing to do with what happens in other countries. And yet, I think the feeling that we are part of a Western community, that we and the Europeans and our democratic allies in Asia formed a kind of cohesive group, and we had clear things to say in the world. And, we were once opposed to Soviet dictatorship, and now we speak out in favor of human rights. The crumbling of that has, I think, undermined some of liberal democracy at home, and vice versa. I mean, as people become more disillusioned with their own political systems, I think they also begin to doubt that sense of community, that sense of, that there is a society of democracies and that they play a role for the world. And although this isn't in the book, this is something I write about a little bit in my journalism, and particularly will do in the future, is that I think the reconstruction of that world in light of new challenges from authoritarian Russia and from authoritarian China is a really important task for the next president. And it can't work quite the same as it did in the past. We need to rethink a little bit about what that alliance means. But yes, I think you're right. I think the decline of a sense that there is a Western community that stands for democracy has had an effect on support for democracy in individual Western countries as well.
Thank you. That segues pretty neatly into a couple of other related questions. Chris says, please say more about the forces driving the Trump base and how best to counter them. And related, Marilyn says, is this an unstoppable trend?
So to be clear, my book is not really about the Trump base. It's not about voters. I don't claim to have a sense of why millions of people vote the way they do. In fact, the more time in my life that I spend reading about voters and reading analysis of voters and reading polling, the less I get it. I don't know why the reasons that people give for voting are so sometimes contradictory that, I don't have a claim to understand. My book is really about the sort of the intellectuals, the journalists and the political entrepreneurs behind Trump, and who created him, who pushed him, who have constructed ideas around him, who to some extent are enabling him to do what he is as president. But I would say that the broader point of your question, which is how to reach, over this divide, and how to end this very deep polarization that we have in the United States, and that, by the way, also exists in Poland and also exists in other countries, is a very real one. And there are a number of ways to answer it. One of the ways to answer it could be through politics. I mean, it could be that, depending on what happens over the next few months, it could be that the Biden campaign tries to run a unifying form of politics that will once again aim to appeal to the whole nation and not just to his own base. And I'm very much hoping, by the way, I don't have an inside track on the Biden campaign, but I do hope that they're going to specifically reach out to Trump voters and try and find a way of connecting to them. Some of you may know about another political project, and these are the Republicans who don't like Trump and who reject Trump, have also created a couple of different political campaigns. One is called the Lincoln Project, one I've already mentioned called Republican Voters Against Trump, who are also seeking to reach those people by using symbols and language that they find familiar. So in other words, showing that Trump is an aberration from the conservative values that they once held. And showing how he's pulled away from things that they once believed in. And this is another, having people who are credible, in other words, who are former Republican voters speaking to Republicans may also be a way. This is another political way of breaching that divide. But there is a much deeper question, which is about how all of us will find a single way to have a single conversation about the United States again and where it goes. And here, there's such a wide range of possibilities. There are a number of organizations now that have tried to set up debates inside cities and inside communities between people, sort of red and blue debates between people from both sides of the divide. There are people who've sought to reach out, both as individuals and as groups across the divide. It may be that, to be honest, I was hoping at the beginning of the pandemic that the experience of our communities jointly fighting this virus would bring us together. And funnily enough, it has functioned that way in some other countries. Mm-hmm. That it has served as it's a disease. It affects all of us, whether we're right wing or left wing or center. And the experience of working together to overcome it, I thought might do that. But almost the opposite has happened in the United States, whereas the pandemic has been politicized partly, I think almost entirely through the president's refusal to acknowledge it as a real problem and who constantly trying to make it into sort of shoehorn politics back to where he wants it to be. From his refusal to wear masks, his refusal to take it seriously, and so on. I've written about that. I've done some journalism about that too. So unfortunately, we've missed that moment. It may be that the process of reconstructing our economy in the wake of the pandemic, again, if Biden wins the election, it could be that in the months after that will be an opportunity to try and bring different parts of the country together and try and reconcile people. Finally, I think one of the reasons for the divide, and this I do talk about also a little bit in the book, is the nature of modern media itself. Mm-hmm. There are many good things about social media, and I want to stress that. And I'm not somebody who thinks that, mainstream media was perfect and we just need to go back to the days when there was only 3 TV stations. But social media has divided people, and it has angered and dramatized politics for people. One of the ways in which Facebook works is that its algorithms favor emotion and anger, and information and ideas move faster through social media if they're emotional. And that's almost antithetical to the kind of rational public debate about issues that our sort of founding fathers had in their heads when they imagined what the public square was going to look like. And finding some way to reconstruct that public square, whether it's through social media regulation, whether it's through creating something new, some kind of public social media, recreating the spirit of civilized conversation it's a long-term project, but it's something I hope that the next administration is going to think about too.
Thank you. I think you sort of touched on a couple other questions that folks had. Let me see if I can. Let's see. Here's an interesting one.
Odd not to hear people's voices, you know, if we were all in the same room together.
I know, it'd be like chattering and everything.
Yeah.
Let's see. I was wondering a little bit about this too. Judith asks, could you comment on the current deep liberal American pessimism and the fear of loss of democracy? And related, I guess what I was thinking is, do you see like an analog to what you've seen in the right happening in the left as there's like a sense of a stalemate, or this division continues to become more exaggerated?
So there is a danger that there will grow on the left. There's a little bit of it already, but that there will grow on the left a similar kind of radicalism based on a similar kind of pessimism about American institutions. You know, if you stop believing, you know, that the American system can deliver better justice, more growth, more prosperity, and a sense of community for people, you know, if you no longer have faith, you know, in the electoral system, you know, if you think that our justice system is unreformable and can't be changed, and if you come to have that radical view of it, then you can get on the left a very similar kind of radical politics. And actually, we've had it in the past. I mean, the violent, very few actually, but the episodes of political violence that we've had in the United States in the past have often come from the left in the 1960s, and then before that at the turn of the century. This also I talk about a little bit in the book, have come from this pessimism about liberal democracy and pessimism about the possibility of improvement that has historically come from the left. And I am hoping that won't overtake the left, and that the belief in the importance of dialogue and the importance of, you know, an inclusive definition of the United States that includes the right, the left, the center, you know, plus all the races and all the religions, remains the goal of everybody who's in politics. I mean, one of the most dangerous things about Trump's Republican Party is that it no longer sees itself as a political party that appeals to the whole nation. It doesn't even have that ambition. And Republicans did have that ambition. George W. Bush absolutely had that ambition. And, you know, I think had 9/11 not happened, one of his great goals was to reform the immigration system and really reach out to, you know, to Hispanic Americans and to bring them into the Republican Party. And whether or not you think that's a good project is neither here nor there, but he was ambitious in the sense that he wanted Republican Party to be a national party. You know, Trump doesn't have that ambition. He wants to win by energizing his base and then possibly by cheating. As we know, he will try to prevent people from having access to absentee ballots, and he will try and carry out voter suppression. And that's now the idea of how to win. What would be really dangerous would be for the Democratic Party, you know, in a different sense, to go a different way, and for it to try to win with just its base, and that for it to win without reaching out to the millions of Americans who are on the other side. And I really do hope that politics, you know, in 2021 will be about finding ways to bring Republicans into the center again, and so that we can have a common conversation.
Thank you. I know it's a little later for you where you are than it is for us. Do you have time for maybe one more question?
Sure, one or two more questions, sure.
Awesome. Let's see. So sort of related to what we've been kind of circling around, Steve asks, what, if anything, gives you hope these days? Not so much in terms of the prospects for electoral change, but with respect to opportunities for establishing or reestablishing a less partisan atmosphere and the possibility of working constructively together across party lines.
So this will sound a little bit cheesy, okay? But one of the things that gives me, so I never taught students before, okay? I just started doing it. And I also happen to have children who are now college age. One has just graduated and the others, I hope, will be a sophomore in the fall. And one of the things that does cheer me up is the younger people that I meet don't seem to have anything in common with the stereotype young people who appear on TV or in, you know, awful Twitter videos. You know, I meet a lot of people who are young people who want to do something, who ask me, what kind of public service can I do? You know, how can I have, so you know, it's almost like the generation of people who are in their early 20s now, and maybe even late teens, I do think are horrified. They see the deep divisions in the country. And I see that a lot of them are interested in overcoming them. And there's this terrible Slavic saying, okay, so here I am in Poland, I can tell you what my Polish mother-in-law would say, which is, where there is death, there is hope, which means that there's always a new generation coming. And I do have the feeling that the particular nature of the current crisis, the pandemic crisis, which has affected so many people, I think has inspired a lot of young people to want to be involved in politics. Right now, they're doing it by marching and demonstrating. But I'm hoping that over the next few years, they find ways of channeling that energy into constructive, you know, building institutions, into working for the government, in improving things. So there is I think there's a lot, there's a lot of hope in the next generation. And also, you know, there are, you know, one meets creative people who are, you know, once we have a political commitment to thinking, what are we going to do about social media? What are we going to do about climate change? You know, what are we going to do about, I mean, to me, this is an issue that I care a lot about, which is the, you know, dirty money and money laundering that sloshes around the world and corrupts politics. I mean, these are, you know, these are problems that there are a lot of clever people who want to work on them. And I do feel that once we have the right, you know, unified political commitment, you know, there's so much talent in our country, in our countries, I should say. I'm hoping that we'll be able to solve things. By the way, I should say that although I know my book is negative and it has this scary title, I think it's really irresponsible to be pessimistic. I mean, it's irresponsible both, you know, because it means that our children and you know, and their children have no future. I mean, we aren't allowed to be pessimistic. You know, we have to want to keep making things better because there are other people coming up who are going to live in the world and take it over. And we need to be optimistic on their behalf.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's question today, but thank you everyone for dialing in and being here and participating in this way that we're participating in book events right now. And thank you so much for spending the time to be with us and talk about your book. It was a pleasure to hear about it and hear you talk about it.
Thank you. Well, I should say it's, you know, first, it's a very short book. You know, you can read it in a few hours and then give it away. It didn't take me 10 years like my book on the Gulag or my book, you know, so I feel very light about it. You know, I won't be offended if you don't like it. It's a very quirky book, but I do hope I hope it's thought provoking, and I hope it helps you think through the people that you know and the polarization that you see all around you. Which is, you know, it was thinking through that inspired me to write it. And then once again, I'll finish by saying, and please support independent bookstores and buy your books from them. You know, they're one of the great cultural backbones, I should say, of the US and of other democracies. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for spending your time with us this afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone, we're gonna start signing off. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Take care, Anne. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks.